Terror and Resonance is a good anime that came out during last year's season and ended up being a really enjoyable show that was definitely one of the better ones to come out of last year. While it was a good show, it didn't have noticeable amounts of problems that came during the series. But the one thing that all these problems had in common was the fact that they all were only problems because of the length of the show. The show's length and pacing can really improve a show and keep your attention, but when a show is limited to a certain amount of episodes with a large story, some things end up being sacrificed. Today we're going to talk about some of the problems of the show, but not in a review sense, but more in just at looking at it and seeing what was missing. So if you haven't seen Terror and Resonance, there are spoilers in this video, so go check out the series first before watching this video, because it's a very good show to watch and you do not want to be spoiled before watching the show. So first, let's talk about Lisa. Lisa was by far the most interesting character in Terror and Resonance. My biggest problem though with the show is the underuse of her throughout the series and not giving her any sort of character arc. We established at the beginning of the show that she is going through many problems in life, from being bullied at school and to coming home to a mother who's mentally unstable. This was a good way to introduce the character and to not only make her relatable but also feel bad for her at the same time. But on opposite end we have Nine, and Nine was probably the least interesting character, not having much of a personality or reaction to most things in the show. It was fine in the beginning of the show because there was mystery behind the character, but because we never get a chance to see him developed or even get any interaction with some of the other characters, especially Lisa or Five, that causes him to become very static and ultimately boring. It felt like he could have been used as much as a good leader or an influence of the group, but isn't used that way at all. Now the second half of the show does go through sort of a rough transition, and we notice this especially when we get introduced to Five. Now Five was introduced about halfway through the show and was obviously brought in as an antagonist to our main characters. There isn't a problem with her or her character, but there is a rough transition between the second half and when she's introduced. It comes out of nowhere and it isn't really given any context until some time later on, after she's already been around. And also during the second half we do go through a police investigation plot involving the investigator who was tracking down 9 and 12 during the first half, but during the second half he begins an investigation to figure out mostly the mystery and background behind these characters. And while the conspiracy aspect was interesting, but it just drags on compared to the plot with our main characters and doesn't even collide well during the end of the show. By the end of the series, Lisa ultimately didn't do much for the impact. I did talk about earlier about expanding her character and giving her more development, but in the context of what we actually got in the series, she was pretty much in a way useless. Her involvement in the show really was just a means to be a damsel in distress, or just be used as a plot for the antagonist to use against 9 and 12. All these things sort of relate in one way, and that really is because of the length of the show. The show only had 11 episodes, and because it only had 11 episodes, we really do feel that there is a lot missing from the show. Almost like there should have been a whole middle portion that could have been there that could have enhanced the show. And the biggest thing was character development and other things as context and even arcs and a lot of background to what these characters are. We never really got to see the characters grow and interact with each other to ultimately see how it changes them. And I think that's the biggest problem with Terror and Resonance, is that you really don't get any sort of emotional impact by the end of the show because everything was so left so cold throughout the entire series. But that doesn't change the fact that this was a very entertaining show and a very fast-paced show, that even though you aren't getting much background, it does help that it's moving fast enough for you to be interested and want to know more about these characters. But this is an example of when you remove so much that you actually lose more impact, and how you actually feel like there is a lot missing from the show. But there are a ton of good aspects in this show that I did not mention, mostly because this isn't a review. But if you haven't seen this show, this is a show worth watching. Just because it has a lot of problems in the show doesn't mean it can make for a bad experience at all, and it is something that I highly recommend you go see. So until next time, this is What's Anime, and see you next time.